everyone. We speak to State Senator Bruce Tarr every Friday afternoon. This week, he updates us on all the work the Senate accomplished, including the long-awaited craft beer legislation. This Friday closes a formal session for the state legislature, and the senator lays down exactly how much critical work will have to get squeezed into the next few days, from the transportation bond bill to the all-important economic development bill, also called appropriately the jobs bill. A heads up, in our conversation about the governor's recent declaration mandating out-of-state visitor quarantines, I mentioned Hawaii's low COVID numbers. That state has had 1,549 COVID cases, with 10% of them requiring hospitalization, just to clear that up. Tomorrow, we have a great interview with Gloucester Police Chief Ed Conley, who provides us with some really interesting insight into the sensitive police reform legislation the State House is working on.
Heather, it's been a really busy week on Beacon Hill, and that's because we're starting to come into the final days of the legislative session, at least the formal session for this year. But we're still doing very important things. And one of the things that we did is an important bill that has to do with restaurants who are now serving alcohol or hoping to serve alcohol in their outdoor seating that they've added to be able to continue to seat people and serve people during the pandemic. And if those restaurants serve alcohol, they need to modify their license, their liquor license, because the premises are described in the license. And if you add an outdoor component, then you've now changed the premises. The difficulty with that is usually the way the process works is the local licensing authority issues the permit for that, but then it goes to the state, to the ABCC, the Alcoholic Beverages Control Commission. And that process of getting it approved at the state level could literally take months. And we know, for instance, on Cape Ann, so many of these establishments need to make a lot of money during the summer because that's when their peak season is, and we don't have months. So the governor had responded to this by signing an executive order a while ago, making a change. But he said that that change really needs to be codified in statute, and that's what we did. So I want to make sure that I get bill numbers right. So I'm going to look down because I never remember numbers. I only remember titles. But Senate 2730 was the bill that does this. And basically what it says, and it's very simple, is that from now until November, that a local licensing board can make the change to the premises and issue the changed license and only has to notify the ABCC and doesn't need to wait for ABCC approval. Wow. So that's a really powerful thing. It's a simple thing, but it's really powerful. And you can see the importance of it on Cape Ann for all the restaurants that they really need this extra income.
Yeah, it's amazing how such a small, it seems like a tiny piece of legislation, but what a difference it can make.
Yeah.
For restaurants, great. That's great.
So it is a temporary measure, but it's a very meaningful one. And hopefully next year we won't have to worry about this, but it is important that we do whatever we can because we're still hearing dire predictions from the restaurant industry itself about restaurants that may never reopen and not survive the pandemic.
So hard. Well, there's some other really important legislation around alcohol.
So there is, and the next piece of legislation that I wanted to talk about is something that has been a really contentious issue on Beacon Hill for the better part of the last decade. And it involves the situation and the relationship between craft brewers, and there are a lot of those now in Massachusetts, there are a lot of them in our area, and yes, and distributors. And so under Massachusetts law, when someone produces alcohol, they can't self-distribute. They must have a distributor. And there has been some conflict that's developed around craft brewers saying that X, Y, or Z distributor is not using their best efforts to be able to market my product. But yet I have an agreement with them that I cannot change and I cannot get out of, except under very tight constrictions. And so the craft brewers for a number of years have been saying, we need more flexibility in being able to break those agreements, which we must have. We must have an agreement with a distributor. Right. And really the dispute has centered around what constitutes a true craft brewer. In other words, how much product can they produce and still be considered a craft brewer that should get more flexibility in being able to change the agreement. And that discussion has gone on for a very long time.
Mhm.
And finally, there's an agreement between both sides to this. And the agreement is that if you produce 250,000 barrels or less of product, then you are considered a craft brewer. And if you are a craft brewer, then you can sever your agreement with the distributor. But, and I think this is an extremely fair provision in the bill, but you have to reimburse the craft brewer, the distributor, for the money that's been spent in terms of inventory that remains and any kind of promotional materials that have already been produced. And so there's the notion that, yes, you can break this agreement, but you also have to make sure that the investment by the distributor is compensated.
Mhm.
And so both sides have agreed to this. It's something that many of us thought we may never see.
Right, right. So what
And
prompted this agreement?
there's been a lot of work done by three of my colleagues, Senator Feeney, who is from Attleboro, Senator Cream, who is from Newton, and Senator Boncory, who is from Winthrop. And they really had the persistence to keep the parties talking and try to get to yes. And they did. And so this week, the Senate has adopted the bill. And again, I'll give you the bill number. It's bill number 104. And the Senate adopted it unanimously. It's now in the House. And our hope is that the House will pass it again because there is agreement and it will get to the governor's desk. And then we can take something off our to-do list that has been on it for a very long time.
That's super exciting. I don't want to dwell too much because I know you have a lot to talk about, but could you just touch upon where the issues started? Like what was making small craft brewers unhappy with their wholesalers? Is it possible to touch on that a bit?
Yeah, so there was a feeling that it was a one-sided relationship, that the craft brewers had to have a distributor, and once they entered an agreement with the distributor, they were subject to the whims of the distributor in terms of who was getting what shelf space, because a distributor will have many products.
Mm-hmm.
And so a brewer might feel that they weren't being fairly treated in terms of being prioritized by the distributor. And they really felt that they didn't have recourse. Now, they did have recourse, and that is indisputable, but they felt like they didn't have enough recourse,
Mm-hmm.
and that the balance needed to be restruck between distributor and brewer. And a lot of folks in our area were key participants in these discussions, and we heard from them a lot on both the distribution side and the production side.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been other attempts and other bills, but they usually centered around how much of the product would be required to be considered a craft brewer as opposed to a major brewer. And they also centered around the issue of good cause and whether or not a brewer would need to assert good cause to be able to terminate the relationship. And the brewers felt like that wasn't always fair to them because it was a higher bar to meet maybe than what they thought there should have been. And so one of the important aspects of the bill, by the way, is actually using arbitration so that the parties can agree to what the distributor needs to be compensated for and what the amount should be.
Mm.
So, but those were the two main sticking points: is who exactly is a craft brewer,
Mm-hmm.
and what should be the threshold for being able to break the agreement.
Interesting. So it sounds as if it may be more competitive for distributors now too, in terms
Absolutely.
of this model?
Absolutely, because the distributor will no longer be able to rely on that relationship always being in place.
Right.
And to be fair, this is one of those things where not everybody fits into the category of being sort of the good guy or the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the distributors will tell you that they tried to market things, and they have a tremendous job to do to be able to market all this product and to accommodate new products, because particularly with a new craft product, it may not always be the easiest thing to promote because people are unfamiliar with it. So they have to spend some effort to get people interested in it. So this was not a one-sided conversation at all, and both sides brought good points to the table. But fortunately, we were able to find this agreement that many people, including me, are predicting will be very, very positive for the growth of craft brewing in Massachusetts, that people will now feel comfortable that they can go out and find a distributor that's going to aggressively market. And if they feel like that distributor isn't doing that, they can find another one. And so it opens up a lot of different avenues here. And again, it's always nice when we can find a path forward that people agree to.
It's great. It is great. So moving on, you passed really interesting legislation regarding people having a stroke, right?
We did, and credit here to my good friend, Senator Mark Montigny from New Bedford. And Mark and I have been friends and worked together on a whole host of issues over the years, primarily because of the connection between our two ports around groundfish and fishing issues. But Mark had an experience years ago with the loss of a loved one due to a stroke. And he began to focus on some of the most important elements of the treatment of stroke in Massachusetts. And really what the bill does, and I'll give you the numbers, so I'm going to look down again, is Senate 1306. And it really is fairly, again, simple but powerful. And so what the bill says is that on an annual basis, Department of Public Health will look at the protocols that are issued for the treatment of stroke and evaluate which facilities in Massachusetts are capable of properly treating stroke and make that information available. And so one of the things that's important here is in Massachusetts, not only do we have the Department of Public Health that's important in this conversation, but we also have regional EMS councils. And I had the honor of serving on ours for a number of years. And the idea behind the councils is they coordinate what we would call pre-hospital services. They look at every licensed ambulance service in the region and how that licensed service interacts with the hospitals that it brings patients to. And the idea behind the bill, which I'm a very, very strong supporter of, is that we'll constantly be looking at where the best places are to bring people that are having a stroke, and that will make that information available, and that we'll have treatment protocols that everyone is aware of. Because the things that we know about stroke is that a timely response can make a major difference, not only between life and death, but between serious injury and a recovery. And not only is time important, but using the right methods, the right, for instance, thrombolytic drugs and other kinds of things. And so what this bill is attempting to do is continue to evolve stroke response by saying that every year we're going to look at these protocols, we're going to look at these facilities, and we want to make sure that people get to the right place as quickly as possible. And then the bill also sets up a commission to look more broadly at issues surrounding stroke. But I really feel strongly about this bill, because all of us in one way or another know someone that's been impacted by a stroke. And obviously people die from stroke, but if they survive, they can also have terrible consequences that they have to live with for the rest of their lives. And we oftentimes ask ourselves about those kind of health conditions, is there anything we can do? And in this case, the answer is yes. We can continue to make the system stronger. We can make sure people get to the right place as fast as they can, and that the right treatments are used. And the important part about this bill is that the legislature isn't saying we know what the answers to those questions are. What we're saying is we know who knows the answer to those questions, and we're going to compel them to work on those answers and provide them.
So I just want to repeat this and see if I'm getting it right. Not every emergency room is set up to be super responsive to someone having a stroke. Is that right?
Well, some are more qualified than others, and again, those pre-hospital protocols are worked out by the EMS councils and Department of Public Health to say, here's where you should be going with a stroke patient. But obviously, every emergency department has some capability of dealing with stroke. The question is, when you have a particular type of stroke, you're seeing particular kinds of symptoms, then where do you go? And we're trying to make that work better, because sometimes, and I'm not an expert on the subject, but sometimes there may be a trade-off between needing an immediate response and traveling a little bit further to get to a different facility that may be able to deal with the stroke differently. So really there's a matrix here, and that's what we're trying to flush out.
And I assume in what you just said that that is including distance, so to make sure that they're within a region, no emergency medical service will have to travel farther than a half an hour.
Right. That's absolutely the case. And again, this is something that we have looked at in the past. The idea of this is not new, but the legislation says we're going to make this an annual exercise, and we're going to bring more expertise to the table. And again, we're going to try to evolve the system to make it better and better and better, and not rest on our laurels, because we do have very good healthcare in Massachusetts.
We do. And we'll touch upon a new healthcare bill pretty soon, I think, in
Yes.
our conversation. So I also wanted to touch upon the, Washington will be, hopefully next week, there will be some news out of Washington about relief for the whole country. And I had read in I believe it was the Washington Post, that there is legislation being considered for small businesses and $70 billion for schools, but there would not be more funds at this point for state and local government. Now, of course, the legislation has not happened yet. It's been passed in the House, but not the Senate. Do you have any feelings about that comment, that there may not be more for state and local government?
I'm deeply concerned about it. As we talk today, we are still projecting a $6 to $8 billion deficit for Massachusetts for the fiscal year that we're in right now. Now, interestingly enough, the governor yesterday filed another supplemental budget, because the one that we're living under right now only takes us through the end of this month. And so the governor filed another 1-month supplemental budget. My projection here is that the legislature will make it more than a 1-month supplemental budget. It'll probably go for at least a couple of months to keep us going, because we don't want to have a shutdown and we don't want to fail to meet our obligations. But at some point, we're going to have to do a budget that covers the rest of the fiscal year. And that could be a 9-month budget. It could be an 8-month budget. But whatever it is, we're going to have to catch up to that deficit. And remember that right now we have $3.5 billion roughly in our stabilization fund, which we've been able to protect by doing some other things. But if we have to go it alone and close a $6 to $8 billion budget gap, it is going to be very, very difficult to do. Again, that is roughly, depending, let's say you take the midpoint of $7 billion, that's roughly twice what we have in our stabilization fund. And so we desperately need assistance from the federal government. And one of the reasons that we haven't moved forward with a longer budgeting timeline to look at more months than just 1 or 2 or 3 is because we're waiting to see what the federal government is going to do. It is that big a factor in trying to get to a balanced budget. So when we hear that we may not see assistance from the federal government, that is something that really deeply concerns everybody on Beacon Hill.
And I misspoke, because this will be broadcast on Tuesday morning. I said next week the Senate should be passing the legislation, but it's actually, this will air on Tuesday morning, and it should be that week that we will hear what's in that package, right?
Right, and that's what we think right now. But of course, we know anything can change and anything can happen. But we have been working under the assumption that sometime after July 20, we would see something come out of the Congress and the administration, and we're still working under that assumption. Mm-hmm. It won't, if the bill passes next week as we expect it to, it will likely still not enable us to do a complete budget by the end of the month, which is when our formal sessions end right now. So we are living with an assumption that at some point, most likely in the fall, we'll have to come back and do a budget for the remainder of the year, however much time that is. But we are all going to be watching very carefully next week to see what happens, because if there is not federal assistance forthcoming, our budget will look very, very different, and it will be a very difficult document to work forward with if we don't get some assistance.
And of course, people are also waiting anxiously to find out about their $600 unemployment checks and whether they will continue. So,
what we're hearing on that front is that there will likely be some continuation, but it may not look the same, and there may be a different test in terms of who's eligible. But there are so many different signals coming out of Washington on that subject. I wouldn't try to speculate as to where they'll wind up.
Right. I think so too. So do you want to talk about all the work you have to do next week?
So, just as a quick reminder, under the rules of the Senate, we end formal debate next Friday at the end of July. And that isn't to say we don't continue to meet. So the Constitution requires the House and the Senate to meet every 72 hours. But when we go past that July 31st deadline, we go into informal session. And the difference is that in a formal session, we take votes, there's extensive debate, and it is reserved for business that requires that debate. When we go into an informal session, we generally take up matters that are more routine. And here's a really important fact, and that is that an informal session, any member can object to something being taken up. So for the heavy lifting for the legislature, you really want to get it done during the formal session. And so next week, when we look at the time we have and the things we need to do, we know we need to pass another interim budget. I mentioned the one the governor has filed. Again, his is for 1 month. My expectation is ours will be for more than 1 month, and it probably will be 3 or 4 months. We also have a transportation bond bill that right now is in a conference committee, and we have a general obligation bond bill that's in a conference committee, so we need to do those. The police reform bill will likely wind up in a conference committee as well. We then have to look at a couple of other issues, one of them being the issue of health care. And we have passed a bill that centers around telemedicine, but does some other things as well. We anticipate that the House may pass such a bill either on Saturday or sometime early next week, maybe when viewers are watching this. And so then we may have to go to conference committee on that to reconcile the differences between the two branches. There is a desire from a lot of us to try to do something to respond to climate change. And I'm hoping that we'll be at least able to take some forward steps before the end of the formal session. And so that right now is what's on our plate, but that is going to take a lot of time to be able to address. And when we get those conference committee reports back, then we still have to vote twice on those, once on acceptance of the conference committee report and once to enact. So we've got a very short period of time and a lot of very weighty subjects to try to address.
Which of these do you feel are going to be the more difficult ones to work through?
So I should mention too, I forgot one from the list, and that is the economic development bill.
Right.
And as we speak, the House has just released an economic development bill, and our representative, Ann Margaret Ferranti, worked very hard on that bill. And the House also added the governor's housing choices bill to it, the substance of the bill. So it now is a housing bill and an economic development bill. So if I try to
touch on that,
I'm sorry?
Do we have time for you to touch upon that, the governor's addition there? Because that's a sensitive subject.
It is a sensitive subject, and I'll touch on it just briefly, and to say that the centerpiece of that bill is really a change in the way that at the local level, changes to zoning in certain instances are accomplished. And we know right now, for instance, if we go to town meeting or at a city council for that matter, there's required to be a 2/3 vote to accomplish a zoning change. The governor's proposal for some types of zoning changes reduces that to a simple majority. And there are some other pieces of it as well, but that's the one that most people are focused on. And so one of the concerns that we have in the Senate is that we won't get that bill probably until Monday or Tuesday at the earliest, and then we would perhaps try to take it up on Wednesday, and that leaves very little time to reconcile any differences. So that's going to be on a very, very tight time frame.
And that's such an important piece of legislation for the coming year.
It's incredibly important. It would be important in any circumstance, but right now it's particularly important because we know that our economy has suffered a lot of damage due to COVID-19. And we really need to do everything we can to rebuild that economy. You know, if you look at what the employment rate was before the pandemic, you know, hovering around 3%, a little bit more perhaps, and you look at what it is right now, in excess of 16, 17%, you can see just how much work we have to do. So it's really important. And I think the members all would prioritize that bill. I don't think there's any question about that. But time is not going to be friendly to us in trying to get through the process. Now, we always have the option of reporting the bill out in part. So if we can't agree on everything, a conference committee might say, we're going to report these items and hold back the rest. So that's always a tool that could be used, but we'll see what happens.
Well, lastly, it will be maybe old news for people by the time this is broadcast, but the governor just made it mandatory for people to quarantine who are coming into Massachusetts, even if you live here and you leave for a weekend and come back, from states other than the 5 New England states, New York and New Jersey. Do you have any feelings about that? I mean, economically, it's gonna, that could hurt some people here.
No question about it. But one of the things that a lot of us have been most concerned about is the threat to the public health of our state from the hot spots around the country. And we certainly see a lot of serious infection trends when we look at a number of different states, Texas, Florida, other places. And I think it would be hard to argue that we haven't done very, very well in reducing our number of cases and our number of deaths. We certainly have had a lot, there's no doubt about that. But as we're moving in a positive direction, other places are not in terms of the increase in their cases. And this has been the subject of a lot of discussion on Beacon Hill, is how we try to minimize the impact of those spikes in infection in other parts of the country. And of course, the most significant and obvious threat is people bringing the virus here. And so this calls for a difficult decision. And, you know, we have had suggested quarantine for a while now. The governor had lifted that for basically 7 states, the New England states and New York, New Jersey. And by the way, that exemption still remains in the most recent order. So we're talking about places from other states. Interestingly enough, Hawaii got added to the exception list. So yeah, so if you want to go to Hawaii, you still have some flexibility.
I think they have 2 cases.
Yeah, it seems that way as well. Yeah. But now there's, you know, $500 fine attached with this. There's an affidavit that you have to fill out that's available on mass.gov, and a required quarantine of 14 days. But there also is an exception that if you've had a negative test for COVID-19 that's within 72 hours, then you're exempt as well. So this order just came out, and we're all trying to read through it and fully understand it. And I would encourage people to go to mass.gov, but it really increases the strictness of the quarantine requirement that in many ways we've had for a while.
Right. Well, again, I think it is really inspiring to see the governor taking this so seriously, and the state also. And I say that there will be economic implications, but it seems as if most citizens in Massachusetts are grateful for to take this whole crisis so seriously and to put people's lives first.
Well, I agree with you. And, you know, we field calls every day from folks that tell us that they are suffering because of some of the things that we've had to do with regard to COVID-19. And I certainly understand that. In fact, I was on the phone this afternoon. I organized a conference call with our lieutenant governor with a particular industry sector to talk about what they're suffering through and to see if there's a way that we might be able to help. And I've done that with others as well. But the fact is, if we suffer from a shutdown and we have to go backward on the reopening plan, that would be really devastating. And we're all trying to avoid that. And we're trying to continue to keep moving forward. Now, it does present an opportunity, and I've seen some folks taking advantage of that to say to the rest of the New England states, you may not be going to an exotic place this year. Why don't you come visit us? Because we've got some really great places to visit, particularly on Cape Ann.
We do, right. One last question there. Has the governor seen any indication of the virus rising at all around the state? Is there anything that he has?
There have been some upticks, and one of them has been in the press quite a bit, and it was as a result of a house party that occurred on the South Shore, where there are a bunch of people that looks pretty clearly like they violated the social distancing rules, and there are already 13 cases that have emerged from that party. So it's a reminder that we can't let our guard down, and so there have been some upticks, and that's something that we continue to monitor and try to respond to as best as possible.
Well, thank you so much for taking time with 1623 yet again and keeping us informed of all the good work you guys are doing up there. So, and good luck next week.
Well, thanks, Heather. It's going to be a long week. I hope by the end of the day, we'll say it was a productive week. I'm confident that it can be. And let me reciprocate and say how much I appreciate, and I know all of us do, the work that 1623 Studios does. And I've said it once, and I'll continue to say it. It is really one of those things that helps to hold us together as a community in these difficult times so that we can learn about what's happening, particularly when we don't have as much mobility as we might otherwise have. And we can continue to hear from each other and support each other. And that's something I don't take for granted for 1 minute.
Well, thank you. I agree. The conversation is really important, and getting the information back and forth is really important. So we'll see you. Hopefully you're standing next Friday.
hopefully. And I look forward to having a lot to report.
Yeah, that would be great. All right. Well, take care.
Thanks, Heather. You too.